Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Fit Chicks Chat. My name's Laura Jackson.
And I'm Amanda Quinn.
And on today's episode, we are talking about habits, and specifically why habit change is so hard and what to do about it.
hmm I know.
I think
It's
this is
funny because
a
it sounds
really,
like it's like a dry topic, but it's so good
oh
and so
no, oh my
important.
gosh. This is the thing that I find so interesting. Like when I first, obviously my journey has changed and there's so many different things that I'm interested in, but habits are the thing that I am the most interested in right now. I'm completely fascinated how it's so hard to change our habits, where our habits come from, because
hmm
essentially our habits are our actions, and our actions create the results that we have in our life, especially when it comes to our health, right? So many things to do with our health are influenced by our lifestyle, which is the things we eat, the things that we how much we move, things that are really within our control, right?
hmm
So I always find this so fascinating because the people who are the most successful for the long term have been able to change their habits. So why is it so hard for us to change these things? And I even in my own life, I know we're going to be sharing some examples. I always find it so interesting when I look at things that at the time when I did them, I thought I'm never going to be able to stop doing this habit. And then now looking back thinking I couldn't even imagine ever doing that again, right? And
Right.
it's like
Right.
where does that shift come from? Like where does that transition come from? So really understanding habits and how they work makes it so much easier to help you understand how to change yours. And that's kind of the way that I've always thought about it.
hmm hmm No, for sure. And I think it is so fascinating to think back to being like, oh, I used to do this way. And I remember thinking I could never live my life not doing this or without this thing. And then all of a sudden you look back a year ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it was, and you're like, "I can't even believe that that's who I was or what I did," or, that doesn't even feel like the same version because it's not the same version of you, but it doesn't feel like the same human, right? For
Yeah.
someone to do that. Like, yeah, and I know we'll go into some examples, but definitely I think about it from that perspective and I'm like, "Man, like there's so many habits that I used to have or that I have now that are so different than what I used to have."
And there's still some now that aren't serving me that I want to change. You know what I mean? But I could see
Completely.
now understanding why it's so hard to change. I can see now how I need to go about changing them and also, what are the areas I need to look at. So one of the
Mhm.
habits for me, and I always say too, just before I get to one of my habits, but like I find it's always been fascinating to me when someone can change a habit so quickly. And some people say it's so hard, like why it takes so long. So we're gonna give you really the way that habits, like why habit change is so hard to understand that. But think about it from the perspective of somebody who, let's say you smoke cigarettes, right? And then you suddenly get a diagnosis with lung cancer. It's like someone could have tried to quit smoking 100 times and they're not successful, but then they get this diagnosis of lung cancer and they're like, they never pick up a cigarette again. It's like,
Yeah.
why is that? Right. And then vice versa, some people can have habits that are so like, you're like, how do they wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and exercise every day? Like, I don't even know how they could do that. Right.
Yeah.
And over time, they've built up that habit. So some habits can change really quickly and some habits take time to build. And they're all very different, but it's because of the way that habit change actually, how it triggers in our bodies, how our emotions
And
are
in our
connected to it,
brain.
and all of those things. So I think this is going to
Mhm.
be a really fun conversation. So
Totally.
for me, one of the big habits, and I'm going to kind of be using this as my example throughout this, is I used to be a night sweet snacker, like a night snacker. So it
Mhm.
would be like as soon as I typically 7 o'clock, right? There would be like a time after 7 would be all day long. I could be eating quote unquote healthy, nutritionally dense foods, and it would be like 7 o'clock would hit, and I would get these insane sugar cravings. Like all
Right.
I wanted was gummies, candy, cookies, ice cream, like didn't crave anything chocolatey. It was always I wanted sweet stuff. And it would be like crazy strong cravings. So now looking back, it's interesting because I don't have that at all. Again, also nutrition has helped that as well. But at that time, I thought it was one of those things I would never be able to quit. So is there anything, Amanda, that for you have a habit that is super strong or
Yeah,
was?
no, for sure. Well, Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I think that it's really important though that you said that you shared that one habit because I think a lot of people, I know even for me, I had that same thing. Mine wasn't sweets though. Mine was savory stuff. Like it was always like chips. I love chips so much. Oh my God, they're so good. I still feel that same way. But I don't eat them really because they don't serve me and they don't serve the purpose and they don't really, and I understand it that and I don't really crave them anymore. Like I can buy them and have them in my house for like a month, which nobody understands. But I can do those things. But I think that that's a really important habit to share because I think a lot of people really struggle with that. For me, I actually have a really interesting thing with habits because um, I remember when I was younger, I used to smoke cigarettes and I quit smoking cigarettes. I decided one day I was going to quit smoking cigarettes and drinking caffeine on the same day because I felt like I was drinking too much caffeine and I was smoking too many cigarettes and cigarettes were not neither of them were good for me, and this was like I was like in, college at the time, so I still remember this because I was studying for exams, and I went in to write my exams, and I couldn't focus because my brain was like it just wanted to smoke cigarettes and it wanted to drink caffeine, and it was, like, all over the place, and it was so, like, foggy, and I remember this moment so clearly. I, like, wrote my name on my exam, I wrote a few answers, and then I left because I left within, like, 20 minutes. I was like, "I can't even focus on this final exam." Luckily, I still passed. I think my grades during the school year were just so good that I was able to still pass, thankfully. But, um, but that was a big one for me because that habit, I stopped and then I picked it back up. And I quit drinking caffeine for 4 years. I quit smoking cigarettes for longer, but I quit drinking caffeine for 4 years, then I picked caffeine back up. Then I picked back up smoking cigarettes when I guess it was when you and I lived together, and it was, like, when we used to do, like, our secret smoking. It
Yeah,
was
I think
like
we were
that
like
weird, like
24, 25.
yeah, and we would smoke just after work in our apartment, and it was, like, this really weird thing that we would do, and, like but it's so interesting to
And
me
it would
because I
always
think the
be in the
habits
same location.
always, always, never in public, never, like, outside, it was just, like, this weird thing, and then I stopped smoking cigarettes, and now I haven't smoked cigarettes again since we came back from our trip in Thailand, actually. I think it was because we got back and we were like we smoked so much out there, my throat felt like it was gonna close on me because I was, like, so raspy from smoking too much, but I remember that moment, and I remember, like, all of these things, and the reason why I'm sharing this big sort of long story is because sometimes habits can be, like it's like they're a daily habit, and then you stop it, and then you pick it back up, and then you stop it, and then now it's been, like, permanent with cigarettes. Caffeine, I still have caffeine in my day-to-day life. That is still something, and that but the difference is that caffeine has become a conscious choice versus before it was an unconscious choice. Before it was always something that was in my habits that was just like, if I don't have it, I feel like there's something missing, there's something wrong. I physically, it would alter like the way I felt. Now I choose to have certain things in my life. And it's like a very different thing versus where before it felt like it had so much more power over me. If that makes any sense.
Well, the thing that's so interesting is, so let's talk about a little bit why habit change so hard about the way the body is built. So one
Yeah.
of the things you hear a lot about with habits is the idea of neural pathways.
Mhm.
So the thing is that we have these different pathways that are in our nervous system, and it sends little signals. There's connections between things that we do and then our nervous system. And it basically, what these neural pathways do is they get stronger the more we do them. So the more we do a behavior, it's like a road, it gets stronger, it becomes more familiar, and it becomes more automatic. So which is interesting is the more we do something, so again, let's say for me, my night snacking, the first time I did it would have been like walking down a new road, right? My
Yeah.
brain probably wasn't like, "Oh my gosh, like this is amazing. We're gonna do this again and again." But I probably got a good feeling from it. So I was like, "Ooh, this felt nice to eat this sugar and to watch my favorite show and whatever." So then the next time I did it, maybe the next night or a week later, and then eventually I did it enough times that it created a strong neural pathway, which solidified in my brain that that's a behavior that I do. So what
That's
happens
just who
is, and
you
then what's
are and what
interesting
you do every day. Mhm.
yeah, so then it becomes something that we do every day, and it becomes even harder to change our patterns because our brain likes to put in the least amount of effort as possible, which is why building a new habit is so hard, right? So when we
Mhm.
decide, hey, I want to start building a new habit where I am not night snacking or I just don't eat after 7 o'clock, that's when I end my eating window. our brain's like, wait a second here. We don't do that. I've never done this before. And it doesn't want to do it. So it's very hard for you at first if you don't commit to going through that uncomfortable phase to do the habit over enough times to build that new neural pathway. And the thing that's really
Yeah.
interesting too about the brain is that we don't necessarily have to actually do the action even to change our neural pathways. We can even just visualize it, which is why visualizing is so powerful. Like we don't actually
Mhm.
have to go to, run the marathon every single day, but if we spend time visualizing it, that's why athletes and stuff like that, there's so much with sports psychology. When they visualize their sport over and over again, they're strengthening those neural pathways. So when they go to do the behavior, it's easier for them to do. It's more second nature. And the same is with habits. So I always think that that's one of the most fascinating things is like, wait a second. It's not that there's something wrong with me that I can't change the habit. I just haven't walked that path enough. I just haven't built up that neural pathway. I haven't solidified this is something that is good for me. So I'm gonna have to get through this uncomfortable time of saying, no, I'm not gonna eat the sugar after 7 for enough times that it builds that new neural pathway.
Mhm. No, and it's so true. It's so fascinating. And it's like it's catching yourself in the act of like the thought or the pattern and stopping it. I always think of it like when you say roadways, I always think of it like that too. Like I always think of it as like it's a street and you're creating this whole, so you're building it, right? Like a construction worker and you're like pouring the concrete down, you're pouring the foundation and you're slowly building this new street in your brain to set this new neural pathway up. But then also for the other one, it's almost like you're putting a barricade up, right? So it's almost like you're doing two things at the same time. And when you're stopping the old habit to create this new habit, it's like it's not going to happen overnight. Like a roadway is not built in a minute, right? We all know. I don't know about any of you, but where we live, construction takes anywhere from
10
1
years.
to 20 years
Yeah.
to complete a road. And it's like no shade to construction workers, but it's literally like things take a really long time because there's all these bumps along the way. And it's not saying that this is going to take you 20 years to create your neural pathway, but there are things that are going to take time and it's not going to be this smooth road right at the very beginning. There's going to be bumps along the way. There's going to be moments where you're going to be like, oh, I wanna do this, but then it's like taking a step back and being like, "Well, wait, do I really wanna eat the sugary snack? Do I really wanna smoke the cigarette? Or is it just because I have habit?" The other thing that I found really fascinating or important when I was changing my habits, especially when it came to smoking, was it was about looking at where I was doing the habits. So like for me, for example, when I was in college and I was smoking a lot of cigarettes, it was when I was studying, which also is why I couldn't write my exam. And then also because I didn't study very well. But also it was whenever I would be driving. When I'd be driving in a car, I would smoke cigarettes. And like whenever I would be watching a movie, I would smoke cigarettes. So these were like the things that I was noticing. So then when I was trying to create this new habit, I was like, okay, how can I find something different to do in those times? So when I'm driving, maybe it's like I'm singing along as opposed to smoking cigarettes. I'm putting on my favorite music. So I'm kind of like, I'm distracting my brain with this and kind of just giving myself the opportunity to not feel like almost like resentment or like I'm missing something. I'm like creating something new, right? Or when I'm watching a movie, it's like, how can I do that? And then that's also why a lot of people, especially when they quit smoking, they find that they snack a lot because then they're replacing that hand mouth motion with something else. So it's like, how can I do this without doing that as well? So but it's finding the patterns and figuring out like, okay, well, what can I do differently in those pattern states to be able to then still continue down this bumpy road to create this new neural pathway, but then also do it in a way that's still going to serve me and my health and serve my future self so that I'm not just replacing one habit with another habit. Because that's also something that some people get caught up in is replacing one habit with a different habit, which I
Totally.
know
And
many people struggle with that.
but that is why, again, habit change is so hard because a lot of people don't understand what's going on, which goes into the second part of this too. So there's the neural pathways, right? So we've got these neural pathways that are built, and also which, just going off of what you said too, which is why we can't beat ourselves up if we are embarking on a new habit. So like when I was going on my 7 o'clock, I don't want to eat anymore after 7 o'clock. And then 2 days into my new habit, I totally went to the store and got a bag of gummies and you know what I mean? Like two ice cream bars. Like you can't beat yourself up because as long as you keep redirecting back and eventually one will become stronger. So it's that's why it's easy to slip. And which is why we want to have this conversation because I think we can't change what we don't acknowledge. And if we don't know why these things happen, we think something's wrong with us. So the second thing of this too is that habits often hit our reward center, right? They provide a sense of reward and pleasure. We do things because of a feeling that we have, right? All of our actions are driven by a feeling. So a lot of times when we're doing certain habits, we're either wanting to feel something or wanting to avoid feeling something. So for me at 7 o'clock when I would be eating, if I actually took a step back and looked at why was I doing that, I was at that time I was single, I was lonely, and it gave me a really comforting feeling to be on my couch eating sugar, watching my favorite shows in my little safe nook. Didn't make me feel lonely. I was, feeling unloved, all these things. It gave me some sort of release from that. And the other thing
Mhm.
too is that a lot of times, like you were saying, the foods that or whether it's health, so the foods or cigarettes or drugs or Netflix or porn or gambling, they hit the reward centers in our brain too. So not only are we trying to feel something or avoid feeling something, it also is, wait a second, I'm getting a hit of dopamine, which is a
Right.
neurotransmitter that's involved in our reward center that says, yeah, this is great. And every time we hit our reward center, it's like that habit gets an extra check mark and our brain says, that felt good. I want to do that again. And then
Yeah.
so we're building these neural pathways. And of course, we're going to do the ones that feel good to us over and over and over again. So it's like if we understand how our neurotransmitters work and how our reward system works and we do things for pleasure, we start to understand why it's so easy for us to get addicted to these things. And I also think, which also kind of ties into this next area of this as well, which all goes with the body, and then we'll start to talk about some different things, is a lot of habits are hard to change because, again, they become automatic over time. So, as you were saying, when you were doing things like smoking cigarettes when you were driving or when you were studying or
Studying.
things like that, right?
Mhm.
It's hard for us to control it because when we've done it so often, it's out of our conscious awareness and it's in our subconscious, right? And then that's when we built that neural pathway and it's like driving the car. The first time you drive a car, you are so aware of everything in that car, the blinker, the steering wheel, the headlights, the radio. You're like, oh my gosh, hands at 10 and 2. And then you drive that car for a year, 2 years, and suddenly now you're driving home and you're like, I don't even remember getting to the driveway, right? That's the
Mhm.
same as a habit, good ones and bad ones, right? So good
Yeah.
ones or the bad or the ones we want to get rid of, they become so automatic. It would be almost for me at 7 o'clock, my shirt, I would just like be at the cupboard, not even, my brain wasn't even there. I wasn't even thinking about it, but I was just thinking about
Yeah.
something else, like my day or whatever. And I'm like at the cupboard, getting cookies out, pouring them in the bowl, going and sitting down. Suddenly I'm sitting on the couch with a bowl of sugar. I'm like, where did this come from? But again,
Yeah.
it's because I've reinforced that and affirmed it with both dopamine and both creating neural pathways and just my body, my brain is telling me this is something that's good and it's an automatic habit now for me. So it's hard to unwind all this stuff, guys. Like it's very hard, which is why this conversation I think is so important because the first thing, and actually 50% of change, is just becoming aware that this is something you want to change,
I was
right?
gonna say the awareness piece is like the number one thing because if we can't change things that we're not aware of, and if we're not aware of it and if we're not paying attention to it, then like you have no possibility, in my opinion, of changing anything. Like if you're not being aware of it, if you're not being aware of the fact that it's like, oh, I'm smoking, I'm sitting here and I'm just taking a cigarette out of a pack and smoking it without even paying attention to it, then it's like, oh my gosh, what is this doing to me? And is my future self going to be happy about this habit in, in 10 years from now? Am I going to be happy that I still have this habit or not? Right. And it's like
Well, so
being
interesting.
just
I was talking to one of
fully
our
aware of it.
students, and I asked the question. I said, we were talking about weight loss, and I said, well, what is it that
Yeah.
you think you need to stop doing in order to hit your weight loss goal?
Yeah.
And she was like, I've never even thought of that. And as we were talking through, she's like, I have a lot of habits that I really need to change. Like, because even that, she was like, I need to stop procrastinating on my health journey, right? Like, I need to stop, like, there's things that show instead of, getting up and focusing on, because for her, she was a more of a morning person, she'd dive right into work right away. and then her health would get put to the back burner all the time. So, but just even that conversation of asking her that, she's like, these are habits I want to change because they're not serving the goal that I have. So it's just an interesting thing if you're not sure of the habits that you want to change. What is an area in your life that you're not where you want to be? And what are the things do you believe that you need to stop or start doing in order to get there? And that's a really great
Mhm.
kind of starting place just to see, like, okay, and bring it into your awareness. Like, wait a second. Oh, why do I always eat after 7 o'clock? Why am I always watching TV and eating sugar after 7 o'clock? Like, I don't want to be doing that. Okay, now we
Mhm.
know something I want to change. Then it's easier to move down the path of change.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree.
Um, the other thing when it comes to why habit change is so hard, and this goes into what you said before, there's two big connections that really tie into habits. One is emotional connections. So many habits are tied to emotional triggers. I'm sure everyone listening, I know me, I know you, Amanda, had totally talked this. Like, there's certain emotions that will trigger certain habits very easily. And it's different for
Mhm.
everybody. So again, for me, things like feeling bored, feeling I'm not a stress eater. I actually don't eat when I'm stressed. But
I do
if
eat
I'm
when I'm
bored,
stressed.
if I'm lonely, if I'm feeling apathetic, like if I'm feeling like I don't care, then I do things that aren't in line with what I really want, right?
Mhm.
Because habits can really serve as coping mechanisms too, which is why emotional eating is such a huge thing when it comes, especially for women. We're not having ways to deal with our emotions, so we end up trying to shove them down. So I think that it's really important that we have to understand the emotional aspect of habit change and know that it contributes, like it makes it really, really challenging.
Mhm. No, for sure. And I think being aware of like why you're doing something and what emotion you're feeling at the time, it's so tricky. Like it's not something that's easy, but when you really start looking at it and you go, okay, like I know for me, I've shared this before on the podcast, but like for me, for example, when I would be like really kind of lonely or feeling like I really just like missed my family when I was younger, especially my mom in particular, I used to always eat this one treat that was barbecue chips and popcorn mixed together, and then the reason why when I tied it all back and I looked at it, it was because my mom used to give us that treat when we'd go to the drive-in when we were young. And so there was such a layer of depth to like why I was actually craving that one thing. And the one thing was because I wanted connection with my mom, and it was bringing me back to those like good feelings of when we were young and when our family was like connected and all of these things. So it's like you have to know that there's like a lot of deep layers. Sometimes it's not layered. Sometimes it's literally like I just do this thing because I just do the thing, right? And that's totally valid. But then there are sometimes a lot of layers to it. And so if there is layers to it, it's like how can you go deep and see where did it originate from? So for me, the barbecue chips and popcorn mix was from when we were kids going to the drive-in. What did that do? During that period of time, my family was whole, it was connected, it was like tons of love and feeling of connection and warmth and all of these things, and we would do great adventures together. Then our family unit fell apart, then I moved out, and then I felt disconnected. And so
Yeah.
whenever I would feel that disconnect, I would then crave that thing. And instead of recognizing that I had a feeling of disconnect and just calling my mom, I would eat the thing to give me that feeling of like connection or love that it kind of like it brought back the memory and the feelings within that memory, right? So it's like there's so many layers sometimes to things, and just recognizing that though and now realizing, if I have that craving, which I barely have anymore, if it does come up, I'm like, oh, maybe I should just call my mom, right? Like I have the luxury of being able to still call her, and so maybe I'll just call her instead and I'll chat with her, right? And I think because I make it a point to talk to her on a regular basis now, I don't really have those cravings. So I wonder, you know what I mean? Like subconsciously, it's like almost like that need is now being taken care of. And so I no longer have that actual physical craving
Well,
because it wasn't really a physical craving, it was more of an emotional craving. And
well,
so
and that's the
it's
thing.
so fascinating. It's so like
If you that's one of my favorite statements. I always say this in the academy, like we do things because we want to feel something or avoid feeling something. So if you can understand
yeah.
what that is, right? Like even, for me to do this podcast, right? Like I want to feel like I'm contributing to the world. I want to feel like I'm, sharing the knowledge that's changed my life, hopefully with somebody who can hear this, right? If I didn't feel that way, I wouldn't sit here in the chair and do this, right?
Yeah.
But if I didn't feel good enough to share this information, I didn't feel that, I'd be avoiding doing this. So it's just so fascinating as you start to look at it from that layer. But it's also going back to what you said, like that craving comes from, you're like, when I feel disconnect, but there's usually a cue that's involved with habits, right? And a lot of environmental cues, like you were saying, the smoking in the car when, or when you were studying, a lot of them too are linked to specific cues, which is a really great way to get onto your habits. Like, why is it that every time I have a coffee break at work, I want to eat donuts? Or why is it that every time at 7 o'clock, I want to eat sugar when I'm home alone?
Yeah.
And if you start to notice, because there's something called the habit loop, and it always starts with a cue. It's the trigger, right? Something triggers this loop that you go into, this behavior that you do. So it's also, habits are so linked to environments, but if we can't change our environment, right? Maybe we can't change where we live, or we can't change our job, or we can't change, what can we change within that to then be able to, that is not a cue for us, or how can we shift that cue? But
Hmm.
that's the thing I always think is just so interesting, is that, habits can happen because, again, there's an emotional attachment. It could be there's an environmental cue that happens. It could be that, it's a date. A lot of people, again, it's emotional and it's an environmental, because a date happens, like someone's passed away, or an anniversary, a birthday, and then suddenly you think, oh, I deserve to, you know, go out and drink 5 bottles of wine. Like, why is it every year on my birthday I do the same thing? It's so fascinating. But again, then it ties back into what we talked about earlier, because we've solidified those behaviors deep within ourselves. But I don't want to scare this with you guys, because we can change these things, right? But I think it's so important that we know how, like, deeply ingrained a lot of this stuff is. And which is why to habit change is really hard, is because we like quick fixes as human beings. We don't want to put in effort, and they take time to form. Even that habit, the bad habits we have, don't usually happen overnight. Now, some people, depending again on your reward system, for example, might drink alcohol once or take drugs once, and then they're just addicted for life. But a lot of us, it's because we've done it over and over again, right? So this is where we just have to understand, it takes time and patience, time to form them, and it takes patience to break them. So just because, and most people don't want to put in the time, they try to change it once or twice, and then they're like, oh, I can't do it. It doesn't work for me. Not realizing they're unwinding all of these other things, which are really important.
Mhm. No, totally. And I think, it's so interesting too to think about habits, and just when you were talking about like how long things can take and stuff. And I think the one thing I just want to add into this is just, if you are in the process of trying to change something that is like, for example, I'll use my dad as the example because I feel like this is such a great example. So he smoked since he was, I want to say like 4. He was probably like a smoker at like the age of 4. It was like his whole life he smoked cigarettes. And he tried to stop so many times with like different books. I remember the worst one that we didn't like in our family was he had this little, it was like a little timer clock that he carried around with him, and it would beep whenever he was allowed to have a cigarette, and it was like weaning him off of it. I don't remember what it was called, but it was like this
Oh,
process.
it's probably like the carb power hour, where it's like you have 1 hour to eat, by the
Kind
way.
of. Totally, and it was like a little, it looked like a little calculator almost, but it was like or like a pager, and it would just beep, and then eventually it would get to you to like having 0 cigarettes in a day, but it would start off with like a lot and whatever, and then he would be fine, and then I remember he took it and he just like smashed it to pieces because it wasn't beeping, and he was like, "I just need a cigarette," but like he tried so many times to quit smoking, and he was never successful with it. And he would sometimes be successful for like 2 weeks, and then he would go back, or a month, and then he would go back. And I just, sometimes there, looking he was always looking externally though at like the answer. He was trying to find the machine, the book, the thing to help him, but he hadn't made the decision though internally to actually change the habit. And he hadn't looked at like, what do I need to do differently in my subconscious mind, in my day-to-day habits, in my things, to be able to then move away from that, right? And so it's like, if you are in an environment that's not supporting the thing, try to find a different way of approaching the environment. I'm not saying you have to move. I'm not saying you have to like, you know, abandon your job because it's like, oh no, I can't be around like the free donuts on Fridays or whatever it is. But it's like, how can I change my own way of being in that environment? Or how can I change these things? I don't know if this is making sense, but it's like, it's such an important thing to look at is like, what do I need to change internally or within my space that I control? Like the things that I can control, what can I change to be able to support the habit? Instead of just trying to find like the solution externally or trying to change everything altogether, what can I just change that is like within my own control or within myself that can help me move towards the end group? To be honest, my dad never ended up quitting smoking. So for anyone who knows, like my father, he ended up getting cancer and he passed away just 3 years ago now. And it's he even when he got his cancer diagnosis, he couldn't quit smoking because it was just like, well, at that point, he just said, it doesn't make a difference at this point because of where he was at. He just felt like it was kind of that was just what it was. That was his decision though, right? And I just think that without being emotional about this, I think it's a really important thing to look at your own life and to see, you know, does this outweigh what I really want for my future self? Right? Like, does this habit, can I go through the hard times? Can I build the rocky road and go through all the bumps and hurdles to be able to get to the other side? To be able to get to the thing that I want so badly, to change the habit, to create a new habit, to create a new pathway for myself, so that my future self will have the ability to not have to carry this on any longer.
Well, I think the one thing too, and it goes, the thing with habits too is they involve both the mind and the body, right? We are
Hmm.
not just our minds and we are not just our bodies, we are both. So some of them, especially when it comes to cigarettes, to drugs, to food, they
Totally.
involve addictions, right? There's different addictive behaviors that physically we have to physically detox from that, right?
Yeah.
So you got your body craving this habit, but then you also have your mind, those deep, whatever it be, emotional connections to that as well. So you've got to look at it from both perspectives. I always think of too, like for me, and this is the same even for your dad. I mean, he never ended up quitting, but like all of those efforts to me, I don't, people say, you quit when you're ready. I don't really believe that you change. I believe it's a combination of all of the efforts. So every time you try and fail, you're still laying down the idea that you don't want to do this anymore. You just didn't do it
Mhm.
yet. Right. So I do feel like for me, one day, and this has happened to me with multiple habits I've had, smoking, my eating disorder, binging and purging, all that. It's like one day you kind of I woke up and I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And it just stopped. But it was because of all of the failed attempts and all of the things leading up to it. Like I remember being in the middle of like a big binge cycle and like binging on so much food and being like, I hate this. Like, I don't want to do this. Why am I doing it? And kept doing it, even though it was in my awareness, even though all of the things. And, feeling like I was destined to be like that forever. But also, my body was so physically addicted to sugar because I was hitting it with such huge amounts of sugar that I also needed to allow my body to release that physical addiction to the sugar and then also deal with my mental and emotional. Now, of course, if you're listening to this and you're dealing with deep addiction, especially when it's physical and emotional, then you definitely should be working with somebody to help you, especially if you're trying to stop something that you are physically addicted to make sure your health will not suffer. But
Yes.
just even that of, that's what I just think. I think one day I woke up and I was like, I'm done with this. And it was so weird because there was like all of this work and then it felt like it happened overnight, but it really was a combination of all of the efforts leading up to that.
Mhm.
And I think that the last thing that I do want to say, which I think is really important, why habit change is really hard, and I think we don't talk about this enough, is really about the social factors.
Oh,
So
yeah,
we live in a world right now where not just our social relationships are the people in our actual lives, but it's our online world as well, right? And if your social circle does not, like, if they reinforce the habit that you're doing or they don't support your efforts to change, it's really hard to break free of a behavior. So
for
I've said this
sure.
example before. I had a student tell me once that she wanted to lose weight, and but all of her friends, part of their friendship was that they would all be on a weight loss journey together, and all fail at the weight loss journey. So it was kind of like their thing, right? Like oh, weight loss is so hard. And then they would, break their diets together and then restart things together. And it was kind of like this, like a place that's what they bonded over. And she was like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I'm ready to completely transform my health. I'm ready to go on this journey. But she was so afraid of her friends ostracizing her because that was their common denominator, and it was sabotaging her weight loss efforts. So it was interesting because we were
Mhm.
talking about it on a coaching call, and I was like, the power of our social circles, because as human beings, one of our biggest desires is to belong, right? Primally, if we are not part of the group, we are like the little deer that's left out to be eaten by the tiger. So we want to be in packs. So as soon as we feel like we're not a part of the social circle, we physically go through like feeling like we're not,
It's on like
like, what's the
panic.
word? Not anxiety, but like ostracized. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's very powerful, and it's powerful with people we've never even met, like people online. If we feel like we're suddenly going to say something, get kicked off our social media platforms, or decide that we want to, create a new habit that doesn't in line with everything that people want us to be. It's very, very powerful if you have a social circle that doesn't support you
Mhm. No,
or
for
support
sure.
your.
And that's why I was saying too, like, control the things that you can control. Don't stress so much about the things that are out of your control.
It's
But
easier said
if it
than done.
is, no, no, of course it is. Of course it is. But I'm saying, like, I think that if that is your social circle, so using the example of, if that's what you and your friends are on, it's like maybe talk with them about how this is kind of like the plan. Could we all go in on this one? Like maybe just like really all go in on like being accountability partners to reaching this goal together, right?
I
Or
don't know.
maybe it's just one of them. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of stuff when it comes to groups, and again, this is for like a different podcast, in terms of, because it's really just becoming, number one, aware if that is causing you not to be able to get, like, change the habits that you want or contribute to the habits that you don't want. But I think it's really challenging when your environment, and I hear this all the time with our students, like, what do I do when I'm on this journey and my family's not? Like, my husband or my wife
Hmm.
wants to, still eat fast food every night. My kids won't eat anything I make, and I'm committed to this. How do I end up doing that, right? And I think that, again, the first thing is always awareness, and there are some strategies to do with that. But I do believe that habit change really is your own journey, because you have to be able to do it despite the circumstances around you. And sometimes that means that you have to stop hanging out with certain social circles, right? Like if you're a drinker and you don't want to do that anymore and your social circle drinks all the time, you might have to not hang out with them anymore. And that's the conversation you have to have with yourself, though, right? Like, because we can't
Hmm.
control other people, and we can ask people to go on a journey, but if they don't, we still have to be able to stand on our own and be able to go for our own changes. You know what I mean? Like, so
Agreed.
it was a really interesting conversation, and it's just, I just always think, from this, all the things we talked about today, the main takeaway is just be aware right now. What are the habits you want to change? What are the things, like, understand it's hard. It can be very challenging, why it's challenging. But then even just looking at some of the things we talked about, like, are there any environmental cues? How do I feel about this stuff? Is my social circle supportive? And then in our part 2 of this podcast, we're actually going to be talking about some different habit strategies to start to implement these things. But just know that you do have the ability to change anything you want, no matter how hard it feels. But it might just take some time and effort, because, again, we're not just changing one little action that we do. We're rebuilding our brain. We're changing our emotional connections. We might be stepping outside of our society, which is why it's so challenging for a lot of us. So I know for me, this was really helpful, because now anytime I embark on implementing a new habit or going after a goal, I know what I'm up against. And I also know
Mhm.
what I need to do to work in my favor. So, um, I hope this was helpful for you guys. We talk about habits a lot in all of our certifications at Fitchix Academy, because if we don't change what we do, we can't get the results that we want. So, if you're interested in learning more about any of our upcoming certifications, check them out at fitchixacademy.com. And we would love to hear from you guys. What are some habits that you're trying to change? And we'll talk to you guys next week. Have an
Bye,
amazing
everyone.
day. Bye.